Prince of Persia is the definition of a dead series. The last real game came out 13 years ago, and that fact just gets sadder and sadder the more you think about it. The original Prince of Persia in 1989 was a landmark title, basically inventing the realistic/cinematic platformer genre. After a couple of sequels with very mixed reception, the franchise was effectively rebooted with Sands of Time in 2003. A critical darling that spawned two mostly well-received sequels and a planned spin-off that eventually got turned into Assassin's Creed of all things. But then something weird happened to the franchise. Much like Devil May Cry would do years later, the Prince of Persia franchise was again rebooted in 2008 in a move that sought to broaden the franchise's appeal and modernize the game. And then, despite a fair amount of critical and commercial success, they just decided, nah, actually, that reboot was kinda lame. Let's just unreboot the franchise, go back to the timeline of the first reboot, and pretend that none of this ever happened, especially Prince of Persia 3D. And nowadays, well, since it's a linear single-player series that Ubisoft can't very effectively turn into a live service nightmare grind, well, this is all we've had from Prince of Persia for the last decade. Except all of that is a lie now, because as I was working on this video, Ubisoft just announced a brand new Prince of Persia game, so stay tuned for a possible video about Prince of Persia and the Lost Crown, though I'm probably just gonna wait till it actually comes out. In the next few videos, I'll be covering what I consider the 5 main entries in the modern Prince of Persia franchise, so if you're interested in seeing those videos when they come out, make sure to hit that subscribe button, and if you feel like supporting the channel and getting your name at the end of the video, I've got a Patreon that you can support if you feel like it. Now, it has been years since I played any of these games. Sands of Time was one of my favorites as a kid, but how well does it really hold up all these years later? And does it really deserve to be remembered as a classic? And spoiler warnings for a game that came out 20 years ago, I guess. So you boot up the game, and it wastes absolutely no time in building up suspense and atmosphere with this gorgeous main menu and beautiful opening cutscene and narration.
Time is an ocean in a storm. You may wonder who I am and why I say this. Sit down, and I will tell you a tale like none that you have ever heard.
This is the Sands of Time's framing device. Inspired by the 1001 Nights, the events of the game are a story being told here by the prince to some unknown listener, and his narration is amazingly well written. It's got a really poetic, old-fashioned style that works great for the setting and tone of the game. And it really adds to the storybook feel of the whole game when the prince's narration gets extra flowery, and it allows for some fun meta touches where gameplay mechanics are written into the story. Save points are framed like this.
Done. I'll start the story from here next time.
And dying will make the prince say something like this.
No, that didn't happen either. Let me begin again.
How bad does your memory have to be telling a story about yourself and accidentally say, and then I fell in a pit of spikes and died? Wait, no, that's not it. Hold on, let me think. At first, it's easy to assume that this is just meant to be the player he's talking to, but this is actually a fun little misdirection. You'll see what I mean later. So the prince's story begins with the king of Persia and his army invading India and raiding the Maharaja's palace, along with the prince who's clearly eager to prove himself to his father. And after fighting through waves of soldiers and platforming through perilous traps inside the Maharaja's treasure vault, the prince finds the Dagger of Time, and discovers that by pressing a button on the hilt, he can rewind time with it. This is the first of the game's 4 design pillars that they use to focus development: rewind. And it's the game's most defining gameplay gimmick, the ability to undo mistakes and even death at the press of a button. This was not just a new bit of lore for the series, but a massive quality of life improvement as well. A lot of Prince of Persia's identity previously was rooted in its realistic platforming, which meant that dying over and over again was pretty much inevitable, leading to some incredibly repetitive trial and error gameplay. The Dagger of Time fixed all of that by introducing basically the world's coolest undo button. The army takes their spoils, including the Hourglass of Time and the Maharaja's daughter Farah, onto the city of Azad. There, the very obviously evil Jafar-like vizier of the Maharaja tricks the prince into unlocking the hourglass with his dagger, releasing the Sands of Time into the city and transforming everyone in the palace into twisted, monstrous sand creatures. Everyone, that is, except for the prince, Farah, and the vizier, who are all protected by the magical artifacts they carry. And these two random people. In this guy. I guess it turned some people into zombies and then the zombies killed everyone else? I'm not sure how it works. Farah and the prince meet up but are justifiably mistrustful of each other. Farah because the prince sacked her city and kidnapped her, and the prince because he just got tricked by the vizier, and Farah won't stop trying to steal his shit. Oh, and because he's definitely a misogynist.
With women, you need to show them you're in charge right from the start, or they'll walk all over you. Besides, what better way to tame her insolence? It's not so bad for a woman to have a little spirit. It's a challenge!
Yeah, so all these years later, this might be the first major sticking point for some people playing this game for the first time, especially in the year of our Lord 2023. The prince is kind of a dick. He talks down to Farah and is really sarcastic for a lot of the game. He's basically an edgy teenager. His abrasive attitude does eventually soften as the game goes on, but I wouldn't blame someone for being turned off by this character at the outset. But here's why his writing is actually really good and why I think you should give it a chance. So, I hate that this needs to be said with the way people talk about media these days, but a character with flaws is not automatically a bad or even unlikable character. From his narration and dialogue in the opening and his early interactions with Farah, we get a good starting point for his character. He's at once pompous and overconfident thanks to his royal status, but he's also childish and attention-seeking, as we can see from his desperate desire for the approval of his father.
From that moment, I thought of one thing only. The honor and glory I would bring my father by fighting like a warrior in my first battle.
And these flaws are what lead to the catastrophic events of the opening. His selfishness and desire for glory allowed him to be tricked into destroying an entire city, including his father, the only other person that he seems to care about. And I really like this setup. The main character has some really well-defined and interesting character traits and flaws. Those flaws motivate the plot and give us a good baseline of where the hero is at the beginning of his journey. And as the game progresses, we can feel and understand the prince's character growth. This is a very focused story, one that has fairly little in the way of plot developments, but a lot of good, slow-burn character development. Over the course of the story, the prince's clothes will become tattered and he tears off the pieces of his outfit bit by bit. This is a very obvious but effective metaphor for his character growth. The hardships that he endures chip away at his sarcastic attitude and glib facade of self-importance and reveal that there's more to him underneath as he slowly learns to trust and care about someone other than himself. But that's not going to stop him from quipping, and the sarcastic prince would become a series mainstay for better and mostly for worse.
I think we need a better plan.
But thankfully, the Sands of Time knows that the glib, quipping hero is only entertaining in small doses. The prince knows to shut the hell up most of the time, unless he's actually got something interesting to say. No words are wasted, and the prince's dialogue never ends up getting grating. You can easily imagine this game being made today by Square Enix or whatever, and having to hear Forspoken dialogue for the whole game.
Yeah, okay, that is something I do now.
Ugh. Instead, the writing is really great, and it's something that I always paid attention to and looked forward to hearing whenever it came up. The prince's lines are only like 5% sarcastic, witty remarks, and then 90% elegantly written narration.
The fabled menagerie of Azad, the Sultan's pride and joy. It had been one of the wonders of the world. As a child, I dreamed of it and longed to see it with my own eyes. Now it was a place of terror, an abandoned ruin laid waste by the sands of time.
And the last 5% is this. The prince spends much of the game alone with his thoughts, or narrating to the listener, and the only character he has to interact with most of the time is Farah. Their relationship develops over the course of the game, and yes, does eventually lead to romance, but this is one of the few examples of the romance forged by hardship trope that actually feels earned in the story. Yeah, it's pretty predictable and a little cliche, but it works. For one thing, Farah herself is not just some one-dimensional love object for the prince to rescue and fawn over. Sure, he saves her a fair few times, but he also relies on her help consistently during gameplay to overcome challenges. The prince cannot solve a lot of the platforming puzzles alone, and Farah helps during combat too, shooting her bow at enemies for you. And it's kinda neat that she's not perfect at that. She can and will hit you if you get in her line of fire, so that makes her another interesting aspect of combat to work around. I also enjoy the fact that she'll gasp in fright when the prince makes a particularly dangerous acrobatic move, or ask what's wrong if you pull out your sword when there's no enemies around. Sometimes it's the little things. Farah's excellent writing also gives her a lot of depth. She's not afraid to tell the prince what to do and that he royally fucked up, but she's also sensitive enough to try and comfort him early on when the prince has just been forced to kill his own zombified father. Farah and the prince's parallel growth as characters is more or less the entire point of the game's story. The actual events that happen from beginning to end only serve to emphasize their arcs. But we'll come back for the end of the story later in the video. Let's finally get to the gameplay. So when I played this game as a kid, by far the best part to me was the platforming. Though it feels a little bit wrong to call it platforming. In fact, during development, this was the second of the 4 design pillars, and the term they used was acrobatics. And that feels appropriate. This acrobatic gameplay is very different from what most classic and modern platformers offer. This isn't Mario, where you've got a ton of different ways to traverse an area and full control over your character at all times. Platforming in Prince of Persia has always been much more methodical, slower, and generally a lot more restrictive. This isn't at all a criticism, but I feel like a lot of platformer fans who are used to having more granular control over their character and having to, well, push a lot of buttons extremely well in order to succeed, might get a little bored of the Prince of Persia games. It's much less about complex sequences of inputs or quick reactions, and a lot more about timing, choosing the right path, and working within the limitations that the game puts on you. In later games, the prince can run up a wall the moment he touches it and do ridiculous gravity-defying feats, but the Sands of Time Prince is relatively realistic. Well, okay, realistic only to the point that it makes sense for gameplay. The prince can run 20 feet up a smooth stone wall in about 0.1 of a second, and he has a dagger that rewinds time, but he also gets insta-killed if he falls more than a couple stories off a ledge. Your feats in this game aren't realistic, but the consequences for failure most definitely are. And all of his moves are incredibly fun to do, even if pulling them off isn't the most complex thing in the world. The prince basically has 2 buttons for platforming that do different things depending on the context. On GameCube, which is where I originally played it, the A button jumps and the R button performs a move referred to in the control settings as special action. And this is most of your contextual actions, running across and up walls, swinging on bars and ropes, that kind of thing. And these moves are basically your entire repertoire. But the game never runs out of creative ways to combine these elements and arrange them in new ways. And you'll also be turning cranks and hitting switches in the right order nearly as often as you run, jump, and climb in this game. The puzzles can feel a little lightweight, but they're still satisfying. This is one pretty complex early game puzzle where you turn on the city's defense system by turning cranks to move giant rods, guided by a hilariously out of place Persian city guard that for some reason sounds like John Oliver.
That's it! I knew you could do it!
And this is one of the few puzzles that doesn't involve really any platforming, but pretty much every other instance of puzzling in this game is gonna sort of follow naturally from the platforming. You either hit a switch or turn a crank that opens a new platforming path, and you follow that to the next crank, etc., etc. You don't need to do a lot of puzzle solving here, but you still get to feel involved in changing the world around you and setting up the next platforming section. And sometimes it's the restrictions on the prince's abilities that make for the most interesting platforming challenges and puzzles. For example, you can't wall run if you're wet, so in certain areas you need to find ways around that by exploring the environment and moving blocks. Sometimes the most direct path is just barely out of reach, forcing you to look around, analyze your situation, and find where the game actually wants you to go. You can't survive significant falls, so you'll be finding a safe path down to the ground as often as you're looking for ways to climb up. All the while hitting switches and turning levers that change the level, create new paths, and excite you for what's to come. I really love the little preview that the game gives you when you enter a new area, like, hey, look at all this fun stuff to climb on. It makes me feel like a kid looking at a brand new jungle gym. It just makes you excited to explore the space. There's a unique sort of glee in watching acrobatics that seem just barely plausible enough for you to think, maybe I could do that if I just lost some weight and spent a few more dozen hours watching parkour videos on YouTube. The prince's animations are weighty and believable even when he's running 50 feet horizontally on a sheer wall. It just feels right. Unlike those parkour videos I loved as a kid, which just made me feel like I was a fucking loser for ever thinking this was cool. Okay, it's still kinda cool. The camera is usually pulled way back too, so you can see all the necessary information, but also so you can see how cool the prince's actions look. Sometimes you'll encounter enemies during platforming, which, you'd think would be pretty cool, but it's not. Realistically, you can't do much with your sword while you're platforming, so they like to just throw in these annoying bats and birds for you to swipe away. But hilariously, there's a glitch in the PC version that makes their gravity reverse when they die, and they just go shooting up into the stratosphere. Stratosphere? And they go shooting off into the sky, so that makes it all worth it. There are some really creative platforming setups here with some equally creative framing to make sure the platforming is always visually appealing. I found myself hitting the landscape camera button in pretty much every area just to marvel at these beautifully realized grand spaces, which, in terms of graphics, have barely aged a day in my opinion. Yeah, it doesn't look photoreal or anything, but it looks damn good. Pulling off a perfect platforming sequence of swings, wall runs, and wall jumps is basically always satisfying. Even if when you break it down, all you really did was press A and hold R a few times with good timing. There's also some elements of exploration here. There are collectible sand clouds scattered throughout that, when collected, increase your number of sand tanks, letting you rewind more often before running out. And absorbing enemies will increase your power tanks, which are the crescents next to the sand tanks, and having more of these will unlock new time powers to use during combat. Some hidden passages lead to mysterious fountains that extend your life bar, but normally you just refill your health by finding any water source around. Yep, no matter how many sand spears and scimitars you take to the gut, a few sips of water and the prince will be all healed up. These really encourage you to fully explore every new environment you find yourself in, and make the levels more engaging as a result. But just for the visuals, you'll already be wanting to explore. There's so much variety and imagination in the levels here. You'll be climbing around the royal bedchambers, then the bathhouses, the sewers, prison, gardens, outside the palace, climbing up a big tower, and everything feels like a unique, real place. Random spike pits in the library notwithstanding. And it all flows together beautifully from one area to the next. And this was in 2003, when most platformers that I can remember were still level-based with no physical connection between levels, with the lone exception I can think of being Jak and Daxter. And despite having a fully connected world, there's no obnoxious backtracking over areas you've already explored. You're constantly getting fun new areas to traverse, and it's all seamless with absolutely no loading screens. I really want to emphasize how impressive that was for 2003, and how the effect has not really diminished with time. You can go through this entire game, this whole massive, gorgeous game, without a single loading screen. The game also has a great sense of the flow of time, taking place mostly over a single 24-hour period that you can keep track of by the scenery and lighting. This was actually the third game design pillar, unity of time and place. This wasn't just, typical of games at the time. It was one of the team's guiding principles, and something that helps make the game feel special and timeless. It really helps to immerse you in the game world, and that, I think, is one of Sands of Time's biggest strengths going back to it so many years later, and this is part of what made it such a massive hit at the time. This game was a technical and storytelling achievement in 2003, and a landmark title whose lasting influence happened so early that I think a lot of people have forgotten about it. It feels surprisingly modern going back to it, at least in terms of structure, production value, and how seriously they commit to storytelling and mood. There's almost no music outside of combat, which could be seen as a negative, but it really adds to the lonely atmosphere. This is a massive palace that's just suddenly become devoid of life thanks to the prince's mistake. Azad has this eerie feeling of emptiness to it that could come across as cheap and lifeless in a lesser game, but here just adds to the atmosphere. And I think it bears repeating that this game is over 2 decades old at this point. And the only things that really feel that old are, the weird plasticky skin textures on all the cutscenes, and the combat. Yeah, so anyone who knows this game knows what's coming here. The fourth pillar of the game is combat. And the combat in this game is kinda notorious for being far and away its weakest aspect. But is it really that bad? The variety of moves that the prince has is genuinely pretty impressive, especially for the time this came out. Your 4 basic combat functions are sword, dagger, jump, and block. They're all pretty self-explanatory, but it's the way that they can be combined that make things interesting. You can freeze enemies with the dagger and then insta-kill them with a sword slash. You can hit the jump button towards a wall followed by the dagger or sword button to leap at an enemy and strike with that weapon. You can counterattack during your block with a well-timed press of either attack button, and that'll make him strike with the respective weapon for that button. And you can hit the jump button towards enemies to vault over them, use the sword to slash them, the dagger to freeze them, or the sword followed by the dagger to instantly absorb them. And that isn't even everything. Not everything works on every enemy type either. Some can't be vaulted over, some are more vulnerable to sword or dagger attacks, and some can be tricked into attacking their allies with some smart positioning. The encounters are very crowd control focused. The dagger is the only thing that can permanently kill enemies, and the animation for absorbing a downed enemy is really long, so you need to be aware of your surroundings when you're trying to finish off a sand zombie. You can easily be interrupted by any one of his 3 friends that are sure to be standing around staring at you the whole time, so it's best to knock down several enemies at once before going in to clean them all up. But that strategy is far from foolproof, since if you take too long, enemies that you've knocked down will regenerate and get back up. There's some fun decision making during combat, and you'll need to experiment to find out what works on what enemies, and how to best prioritize knocking down and absorbing enemies. So, maybe everyone else is wrong, and the combat is actually secretly genius, and totally underappreciated, right? That'd be nice, but no. Unfortunately, no, it is basically as bad as everyone says. And it's kinda sad to me because I can clearly see what they were going for here. The fights in this game are meant to be chaotic brawls where you need to keep track of multiple enemies, decide when to absorb and when to crowd control with sword swipes, constantly watching your back for surprise enemy spawns, and using your sand powers and acrobatics in creative ways to beat enemies. That's what they were going for. But in the end, it's just too slow, sticky, and frustrating to be really any fun at all. And this isn't just a matter of me having been playing a bunch of character action games lately and this just being inferior by comparison. It really is extremely rough. Each fight takes multiple minutes because enemies keep spawning in, there's no good way to tell if an enemy is going to block your sword swings or not, and if you guess wrong, you're stuck in this really long recoil animation that leaves you super open to attacks. Getting the counter move to work right is really finicky too. Holding R to block and hitting the attack button will make the prince do this awkward little lunge that you have to get to touch an enemy's attack to counter it, and the timing is very weird and not very satisfying. The prince's auto-targeting is also really unreliable. It can leave you just impotently stabbing at an enemy when you're trying to absorb the downed zombie 5 feet to the left of it. Combat animations are frustratingly long and slow, and the prince's general movement during combat just feels like he's moving through molasses. My suspicion is that a lot of this has to do with them wanting to keep the animations of the prince somewhat realistic. This works well in other places where you can just sit back and marvel at the detail and effort they put into animating the prince. And in combat, yeah, it's still impressive, but it comes at the cost of making the combat feel slow and unresponsive. Absorbing an enemy that's just out of range requires a cool animation where the prince flips and does a big flourish before stabbing them with the dagger. Again, looks cool, but leaves you super open to attacks and doesn't feel all that good to actually perform. The prince's first couple sword swings are usually pretty fast, but then he has to do these big, slow finishing moves that look neat, but just end up getting blocked half of the time anyway, so what's the point? And to the best of my knowledge, there are no animations that can be cancelled, so once you hit the button, you are committed to whatever long-ass animation decides to play out. And all of this comes together to make combat that is fun to look at once you are pretty good at it, but is far too frequent, takes way too long, is surprisingly hard for all the wrong reasons, and mostly just serves to frustrate the player throughout the entire game. So after playing this game many times, here's a guide for getting through combat as painlessly as possible. So against basically every enemy, your first thing that you try should be vaulting over them, slashing with the sword, and then hitting the dagger to absorb them. This is the default move that's like the easiest way to pretty much insta-kill any enemy that it works on. And when you eventually run into the few enemy types that this doesn't work on, you just hit jump next to a wall and then hit attack. This makes you do a little wall dive move that knocks over pretty much every other enemy. So you just keep absorbing enemies until your sand tanks and power tanks are full, and once you've unlocked the super speed power, hit rewind and block together and use it to kill everything. Rinse and repeat. Do not bother using slow-mo or time freeze. They're a complete waste of your power tanks in 90% of situations. It's almost always better to just post up near a wall and just dive at your enemies over and over like you're playing dive kick. So yeah, I hope you like seeing these few animations, cause you're gonna be seeing them a lot. It's really a shame, cause I like some of the aspects of the combat. I mean, as a kid, I fucking hated it, but revisiting the game, I can appreciate the effort and what they were going for. The animation on the prince is insanely impressive for 2003, and it's still kind of impressive today. And I like that the prince's strongest moves involve using the environment to your advantage. It really fits with his acrobatic skill set. I like that the combat isn't just as simple as depleting a series of health bars in sterile arenas like some other games that came out in 2003. You have to actually think strategically about how to deal with enemies that don't just die when they fall over. And combat is also where your ability to rewind time presents some of the best opportunities for interesting decision-making and strategy in the entire game. Since the rewind ability can be used literally any time, you can use it for more than just undoing death. If an enemy catches you off guard and takes off a big chunk of your health, you can easily rewind to just before it hit you, and now, knowing exactly what it's going to do, dodge or counter it easily. It starts to feel not just like you're rewinding, but like you're always able to see a few seconds into the future. It's some real One Piece observation hockey shit. It's pretty cool. Engaging with the combat in this way makes it a lot more interesting, and the rewind mechanic is robust enough to allow for decisions like this to be made without the player needing to be explicitly told about it. If only it controlled better, this might actually have saved the combat, but as I've said previously, the combat is sticky and frustrating when you don't have it figured out, and once you have figured it out, it's mostly just kind of annoying and boring. So yeah, the combat is something you're unfortunately just gonna have to kinda slog through if you want to experience Sands of Time's fantastic platforming and great story. So let's go ahead and put up one final spoiler warning here as we talk about the end of the game. After the Sands of Time are let loose and turn everyone in the palace into sand creatures, the prince and Farah make a long journey together through the palace. Through the gardens and the Sultan's zoo, down into the caverns and catacombs below the city, through empty military barracks, a massive library, and finally to the Tower of Dawn, where the evil vizier is keeping the Hourglass of Time. And while they're in the tower, just before they're about to win, a magic future sand vision seems to show the prince Farah betraying him and stealing the dagger from him. When they reach the Hourglass together and are about to undo the damage the Sands of Time have done by putting them back in the Hourglass, the prince hesitates, and the vizier uses that moment of doubt to send the prince and Farah tumbling down into the dark tombs of the palace. This may seem at first like a strange moment, like, what good reason does the prince have at this point to hesitate? But I think this is accurate to his character. Remember that the prince is selfish and distrustful, and though he's gotten better as the game has gone on, there's still a lot of that left in him. It's not just that he doesn't trust Farah at this point due to the dagger's vision, he's also questioning why Farah is trusting him. Part of this is his own lack of confidence in himself. The prince is, from the beginning, a little daddy's boy who just wants his dad to approve of him above all else. And I think he still feels like Farah's trust in him is misplaced. But also, he's selfish. Him putting his own desire for glory above the needs of others is what got them into this mess in the first place. It's not in his nature to put the greater good above his own desires. So it makes sense for him to be suspicious of Farah's desire to do the right thing, even if it means teaming up with someone who she has every reason to hate. He would never do that, so in his mind, Farah must have some ulterior motive. But the prince's distrust in Farah here nearly costs him everything. The vizier uses magic to knock the prince and Farah off the tower, and after an intimate night in the palace's mysterious, seemingly magical baths together, Farah ultimately does steal the dagger from the prince and goes off to stop the vizier herself. Chasing after her without the dagger and unable to rewind time, the prince tries to save Farah, but ultimately can't stop her from letting herself fall to her death to save him. And in his grief, he stabs the dagger into the Hourglass of Time, rewinding the prince back to the opening cutscene, to before his father's army sacked the Maharaja's palace, to before he even found the Dagger of Time, undoing all of the events of the game. But he still has the dagger and all of his memories. Here we find out that the framing device all along has been the prince telling the story to Farah. The vizier shows up for the final boss fight and is defeated by the prince, preventing all of the events of the game from ever happening. The prince is able to successfully undo the horror he caused, but in doing so has to give up the most precious thing he gained along the way, his relationship with Farah, who no longer has any memory of him or the journey they took together. This bittersweet ending highlights the consequences of the prince's selfishness, but also highlights his growth, and the story is careful not to reward the prince for his callousness at the beginning of the story. He's a changed man, but that change didn't come easily or painlessly. This story, in my opinion, is one of the best game stories of all time. And my summary really doesn't do it justice. You should just play this game. but how best to go about doing that, that's kinda hard to answer. There are some issues that need to be addressed when it comes to playing this game on modern hardware. If you've got a GameCube, PS2, or OG Xbox and are willing to fork over some cash for a 20-year-old disc off eBay that, probably looks like this, well, then you're in fine shape. The original console versions of this game are perfectly solid and playable today. It's if you want to play this game on modern hardware that you're gonna run into some trouble. The original Xbox version is backwards compatible and playable on the Xbox One and Series X, but I don't have either of those, so I can't speak to how well they run there. By far the cheapest way to get all the Prince of Persia games on PC is Ubisoft Connect, which just makes me feel dirty to have on my PC. The Steam version is only $10 though, and totally worth it. But on any PC version, the camera makes these constant jerky movements during combat. I'm not sure why that is, though I experienced a little bit less of this when I unplugged my mouse. I played with a gamepad, and there's no way to disable the keyboard and mouse in-game, so I think having the mouse constantly on and registering slight movement might have been causing this. There's no widescreen, unfortunately, and the resolution is limited to 1280 by 960, but to be fair, this is just a straight port, it's not an HD remaster, so that's to be expected. And there are actually some mods out there to deal with this, and they seem to work fine. With mods, I was able to get it running at 1080p, 60 FPS, no problem. And the resolution mod that I used actually fixed the camera stuttering issues, so I don't know why, but it did, so that's nice. There's also some audio problems. Cutscene audio gets desynced if an in-engine cutscene goes on too long, which isn't that big a deal since there aren't a ton of cutscenes in the game and most of them are pretty short. The pre-rendered cutscenes aren't affected by this, so I think it's an issue with the game frame rate running a little too fast and the audio running at normal speed. Again, you're going to need to do some modding or some messing with your settings to fix this, but it can be done. Again, the widescreen mod I used ended up fixing this, since I think it let me accurately limit the frame rate. Unfortunately, one thing that the mods were not able to fix is that the audio is terribly balanced, with sound effects constantly drowning out the dialogue, which is a real shame since I love the dialogue and voice acting.
Well, what are you waiting for?
I'm afraid. What if I get into trouble and you have to come chasing after me?
Seemingly, no matter how much I changed the audio settings, the dialogue was always just a little too quiet, and of course, there's no subtitles. Great. The PC port unfortunately has so many issues that I can't wholeheartedly recommend it. Again, mods can solve most of it, but not everybody feels like installing a bunch of mods. All its issues can be worked around, but out of the box, it's not the best way to play the game. That said, the GameCube version that I got through completely legal means, it starts with the name of a bird, if you catch my meaning, had its own set of issues too. Mostly, again, the issues are with the sound. It's all mixed fine on the old console versions, but everything is just really low quality since, 2003. So, pick your poison, I guess. Genuinely, I think the best way to play the game is probably just to get an original copy and play it on some original hardware. The PC version is super cheap, but original used copies are not too expensive either. However you can get it, I highly recommend giving this game a look. In the end, yeah, this game is a classic for a reason, and well worth a playthrough even 2 decades later. There's a lot that modern gaming owes to Sands of Time, especially when it comes to story. The acrobatic gameplay is just timeless, and the game really only shows its age in the unrefined but conceptually interesting combat. So anyway, that's gonna do it for this video. I hope you guys enjoyed it. The rest of the Prince of Persia games will be coming out eventually after this, and I also think I'm gonna do some more videos looking at indie games, shorter videos like the Pizza Tower one. So yeah, if you're interested in those, subscribe, and I'll see you next time. Thanks for watching.